Hey, Cypher here, and I wanted to answer a question that comes up a lot, which is, what caused the Mexican-American War, and therefore the Texas Revolution before it? Well, that's easy. It was a greedy land grab by the United States. No. This is warfare. It's never that simple. You'll hear people talking about these wars like that, but that's an oversimplification to the point of absurdity. It was a long buildup of tensions between the two countries before Mexico was even created. The first question you have to answer is, what caused the Texas Revolution? So basically, we're covering two wars, so that's why I'm splitting up these episodes. First, what caused the Texas Revolution, and what caused the Mexican-American War. The tensions had manifest destiny at their core, but to understand how that is, we have to understand the buildup of tensions between the two countries. Regardless of whether you think the Mexican-American War or the Texas Revolution were just wars, you have to understand this deeper history, or else your opinion is pretty much without merit. Buckle up, because I'm talking about filibusters, land laws, Amerindian depredations, the internal politics of both countries, and the tribes in between. Notice that I don't care about the actual fighting, but the cause and effect. You can find the strategy and tactics elsewhere. I'm concerned with cultural significance, as in change over time. So yeah, what caused the Texas Revolution? Even before Mexico gained independence, Americans were seeking to annex her future territory. There were several filibusters into Spanish land, one that was successful in West Florida. These were private military expeditions into Spanish lands with the hope of taking territory. They were not the US government, but sometimes the US gave support to them, especially in the case of West Florida. Filibusters explicitly violated the 1794 Neutrality Act. But that just shows we have a long history of coming up with creative ways to violate our own laws and get what the people want. Spain lost the Louisiana Territory because Napoleon used his power over the Spanish Empire to take it back for France. But after Napoleon decided he couldn't use Louisiana as a base to take back Haiti and restart the French Empire in the New World, he chose to offer the territory to the Jefferson administration as kind of a reconciliation after the previous administration's Quasi War. Jefferson jumped at the chance to purchase the land and made a bold claim to how much land the purchase counted as. Essentially, the US argued that the Louisiana Purchase included the entirety of the Mississippi watershed. This was a massive expansion of US territory, but Americans argued the purchase included even more. Back in 1685, a French expedition accidentally settled in what would become Texas. The colony only lasted a meager 3 years, but Americans acted like that was still part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. One Spanish official in the territory worriedly wrote, "The United States have purchased Louisiana from France, and if they succeed in establishing themselves on the limits of Texas, God keep us from their hands. The US government is the most ambitious, restless, unsteady, cavilling, and meddlesome government on earth." The US did not establish such territorial claims, even going so far as to declare neutral ground between Louisiana and Texas in 1806. That didn't stop filibusters from trying to establish it, though. Given the Mexican War of Independence was going on, a radical named Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara gathered support for an American invasion. Many Americans joined him, including another leader named Augustus McGee, who resigned from the US Army, taking many soldiers with him and Gutierrez into Texas. They helped to create an independent republic out of Texas through force, and they almost succeeded in 1812. But the fighting took a nasty turn when the Spanish started executing prisoners. A spiral of prisoner executions continued on both sides, and many Americans disassociated themselves with Gutierrez after that. The disunion allowed Spain to take back Texas, ending with the Battle of Medina, the deadliest in Texas history. In retaliation for the filibuster, the Spanish executed around 300 of them, including all of the captured Americans. Well, that sent a strong message, and US citizens took notice. They were outraged by the bloodshed. Fighting broke out again in Spanish Florida because Seminoles raided into Georgia, which allowed Andrew Jackson to lead a force to take Florida. This wasn't the first time the US intervened in Spanish Florida. There was the annexation of West Florida in 1810, substantiating a filibuster republic there and adding it to Louisiana. Then, there was another filibuster by a Scotsman redundantly named Gregor MacGregor. After seizing the island of Amelia in 1817, he and a French pirate named Louis Aury started illegally selling slaves from Africa, despite a US embargo in 1807. So the US took the island to stop the trade, and the Spanish could do nothing about it. So, of course, Spain couldn't control the Seminole War, and they came to the negotiating table in 1819. Though the negotiator and Spanish ambassador in Washington, D.C., by the name of Luis de Onís, was angered at Spain's inability to enforce her own borders. The resultant Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819 bought Florida for $5 million, but also officially relinquished U.S. claims to Texas. This established the border that would remain until 1845. That treaty said the U.S. would cede and renounce all their rights, claims, and pretensions to the territories described by the said line. Some Americans took umbrage with that concession. A newspaper trumpeted, "Some of our citizens desire to possess the country to the Rio del Norte." The very year of the treaty, another filibuster expedition crossed the Sabine River into Texas to do just that. A former U.S. Army surgeon named James Long gathered men and supplies in Natchez, including some famous names like Jim Bowie and the dread pirate Jean Lafitte, whom he'd fought alongside during the Battle of New Orleans. But Lafitte was actually acting as a double agent. They set up a point they aptly named Bolivar Point after Simon Bolivar, who had sponsored a number of filibusters against the Spanish Empire and was dealing with expeditions of his own in South America at the same time. They couldn't supply themselves well enough, though, so a tiny force of Spaniards routed them. Long did try again in 1820, but the minor foothold he took was easily recaptured. He was shot in a Mexico City prison. So endeth American filibusters into Texas. The following year, the Mexican Empire was acknowledged as independent from Spain, including Texas. A whole new government controlled the land Americans so desperately wanted. And another threat loomed large in the north, making Mexicans open to new possibilities in Texas. Northern tribes in New Spain had been pacified in the 1780s, mostly thanks to the Nuevo Mexicano governor Juan Bautista de Anza, who led several expeditions against them, bringing the tribes under a system of somewhat peaceable coexistence. The Mexican War of Independence destabilized relations, and the Apache, Navajo, Ute, and Comanche tribes began raiding anew. To some Mexicans, these raids were downright apocalyptic, where even the Mexican war minister despaired about the North becoming immense deserts in the wake of these attacks. They were certainly brutal, and escalation in violence and vengeance came to rule every raid and counter-raid. When the Mexican Empire was overthrown for a federal republic in 1824, an American had the solution. The man was aptly named Moses Austin, for he led his people to new lands, but died before their deliverance. Austin actually received a land grant from Spain in 1820, but couldn't come because of the craziness of the War of Independence. He died a year later, but his son, Stephen F. Austin, led an expedition to San Antonio to get that grant from Mexico. He created the impresario system, where land grantees would make colonies in Texas. Austin's colony was somewhat of a prototype, but the new federal government authorized duplication of it. They were granting all kinds of lands. I mean, look at this. You see those grants in what is New Mexico? That's a source of a lot of problems Texas had with New Mexico, then and well into the 19th century. Here's the funny thing. None of those grants were ever operated, and the contracts were voided after 2 years of non-use. That was really Comanche territory. Did these colonies stop Comanche raiding? No, they just displaced it. Since the impresarios and colonists had to fend for themselves while also abiding by Mexican laws, they grew annoyed by what they were contractually obligated to do. These Texians supposedly had to convert to Catholicism, learn Spanish, and document themselves with Mexican authorities. Plus, the army gave them arms and ammunition to defend themselves from Comanches. This was the reason why the Texas Rangers first came to be, to fight Comanches. So do you think these American-Mexican immigrants calmly abided by the rules? Of course not. Illegal immigration, open defiance of the law, and a highly armed populace under siege from Amerindian depredations became a combustible situation. Soon Texians rebelled. One impresario declared independence in 1826, but this was put down with the help of Austin's militiamen. Then there were disputes over the constitutional law abolishing slavery. A post commander in Galveston Bay, who was himself an immigrant from America, became controversial for upholding abolition. The settlers rebelled against him a couple of times. Things weren't going well in the South either. After a series of coups, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna overthrew the government in 1832. During the confusion of that insurrection, the Federalists gave permission to Austin to separate Texas from Coahuila, but Santa Anna refused in fear of possible Texas secession, even imprisoning Austin for attempting it. Santa Anna did give a little political independence to Texians, but soon started to centralize power instead, dissolving the Constitution in the process. His centralist government inspired numerous revolts, including 2 just south of Coahuila y Tejas in Zacatecas, and a filibuster in Tampico, Tamaulipas. The Texians were antsy. There just needed to be a spark. Well, that came in September of 1835, when a Mexican soldier smacked a local citizen in Gonzales. Everyone was outraged, and the Centralists sent a company to disarm the locals of their cannon. A brief battle outside the town led to an accord, but the commander of the Centralists had to follow his orders. So the Gonzalans raised the now famous flag saying, "Come and take it." Well, the Centralists couldn't fight a barricaded cannon, so they retreated. This was just the spark needed. Texians began to rise in rebellion all over the territory. They formed a congress called the Consultation, which approved the creation of a provisional government and an army under Sam Houston, but declined to declare independence despite many arguing for it. Thus far, this was pretty similar to the American War of Independence, except the Texian army was successful. They drove Centralist forces out. In response to all the rebellions, the Centralists created a new constitution, called the 7 Laws, centering even more power in Mexico City. Santa Anna had actually given up the presidency on an interim basis so that he could lead the fight against the rebellions happening throughout Mexico. But this just added more fuel to the Texian fire. A decree was issued by Jose Maria Tornel that said the US was fomenting the rebellion and all Texian rebels would therefore be treated as pirates to be executed upon capture. Coincidentally, where we get the term filibuster, as in land pirates. Much of the Texian forces were reinforced with fresh Americans who joined the fight by crossing the Sabine River, and the Jackson administration offered kind words for the rebellion, though they gave no direct aid. Despite that, the newly empowered Santa Anna marched northward. Before they reached their target, a convention was held by the Texians at Washington-on-the-Brazos. There, they declared independence. It made clear that the rescinding of the 1824 Constitution was their reason for secession by saying the Mexican government, by its colonization laws, invited and induced the Anglo-American population of Texas to colonize its wilderness under the pledged faith of a written constitution, that they should continue to enjoy that constitution, liberty, and republican government to which they had been habituated in the land of their birth, the United States of America. In this expectation, They have been cruelly disappointed, inasmuch as the Mexican nation has acquiesced in the late changes made in the government by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who, having overturned the constitution of his country, now offers us the cruel alternative, either to abandon our homes, acquired by so many privations, or to submit to the most intolerable of all tyranny, the combined despotism of the sword and the priesthood. There's a lot to unpack there, but before anything could happen, the very Santa Anna mentioned in the declaration marched his army on San Antonio. This caught the Texians off guard, and they had to flee back to the fortified mission. After a 13-day siege, a final assault took the Alamo. Santa Anna's rage was absolute, taking no prisoners. Among the dead were Davy Crockett,
King of the Wild Frontier,
and Jim Bowie. Santa Anna marched on Goliad next, where he continued his no prisoners policy, executing 425 Texians. The Alamo and Goliad turned the war rather nasty, just like the Gutierrez-McGee expedition. The Texians fought a rearguard action as they retreated to regroup. They turned things around at San Jacinto, where the now classic phrase, "Remember the Alamo," brought Texian forces together. They overran the Mexicans and slaughtered them, turning the battle into a massacre. Only 11 Texians died, versus 650 Mexican fatalities. It was essentially the final battle of the war, because they captured Santa Anna in the process. A couple days later, they made him sign a treaty where he promised that he'd lobby Mexico to recognize Texan independence. The story of that will have to wait for the next episode, where I'll talk about the time between 1836 and the Mexican-American War. But before that, let's talk about what the heck went down here. Was the newly formed Texas Republic simply Americans invading Mexico? Did Mexico not know what she was getting into creating the impresarios? Was Texas simply another aggrieved locality seeking separation? Well, let's go back to that declaration. It's true that the Texians were invited to colonize Texas, but only under certain conditions. These conditions were violated every which way possible, from the importation of slavery to the refusal to register and convert to Catholicism. The war party in Texas was not simply aggrieved. They say so in the declaration, specifying they expected to be treated as Americans in Mexico. That's not what they agreed to. So no, it's not as simple as seceding because of the Centralists, and this long history proves it. But the fact is, Texas was one of a few successful rebellions against the Centralist regime. The others were Alta California and the Yucatan. These others also have their own local causations beyond simple centralism, but a fire is not built by kindling alone. That other stuff for Texas was years of filibustering, rebelliousness, and dealing with Comanche raiding. We can't forget that there were many Tejanos among the Texians, many of whom merely joined to fight centralism. So this is complex. But that's the thing about violence. A root cause might be there, but it is muddied by a lot of different issues. So what do you think the root cause was? Was it American expansionism? Mexican tyranny? American Indian depredations? A bunch of people simply refusing to cooperate? The list is endless. And it's only going to get more complicated, because the next episode will tackle the Mexican-American War itself. Tamaulipas. King of the Wild Frontier.